How to build responsive Angular dashboards with Wijmo, Part 2, Charts and Gauges. Welcome to the second video in our Building Responsive Angular Dashboard series. In the last video, we walked through the application setup process, installing the Wijmo library to access our dashboard components, then setting up the dashboard layout. In this video, we'll add controls to our dashboard to display some data. First, we'll set up panels that show basic user statistics, including tooltips to display additional information. Then we'll set up a FlexPy control to display the site's total sessions, as well as new and returning visitors. After that, we'll integrate Wijmo's FlexChart controls to display data on browser and device usage. Finally, we'll use linear gauges to show information on the countries that provide the most visitors. To begin, create a component that will display basic information and tooltips to provide additional context, and name it current-info. Inside the current-info.component.html file, add some markup to display our data. The first card will display the current active sessions and a comparison to sessions this time last month. In the markup, create the header for the card, add an icon, and attach a tooltip to that icon, which will display this month and last month's information, as well as the difference between the two. You can add a tooltip to any existing element simply by adding these Wijmo properties to the element. Now the tooltip property we're using on the icon is Wijmo's Tooltip Control. Since we've imported Wijmo's Tooltip component, we can assign the properties on the element, and the Wijmo library will handle the rest. Using these properties, we assign what will display in the tooltip and where it will display in relation to the icon, in this case, below the icon. We will copy this structure 3 more times, with some slight changes to the data that will be displayed in the information card to also show load times, an apdex score, and bounce rates. With the markup created, let's add some CSS to style the element so that it fits in the dashboard. Open the current-info.component.css file. Similarly to what we did in the app.component.css file, we'll create a grid, assign the information panels to spaces in the grid, and customize the elements inside the information panels. First, let's set up the grid itself. This grid will only include 4 elements, so we only need 4 template areas. Then add each child element to each grid area. Next, add some styling for the headers, values, and to display whether the change value is positive or negative. Finally, add 3 media elements that will alter the grid layout, along with additional CSS depending on the screen size. With all the CSS set up, the last thing to complete before adding the component in markup is to set up the tooltip text and some sample data that we can display on the page. Inside the current-info.component.ts file, add variables to be used for each of the tooltips, as well as some sample data inside a few objects that will be displayed in each of the panels. Finally, in our app.component.html file, add the component inside the div element with the load_info class. Now, when we run the application, we'll see all of our current information panels, and we can view the tooltips we've assigned to each icon. Next, we'll integrate charts into the dashboard using Wijmo's chart control, FlexChart. First, let's set up a new service to serve up all the data that will be displayed in our dashboard. For the purposes of this demo, we'll just use mock data. Inside the data.service.ts file, create a variable called session data, which will hold an array of objects. These objects will hold the number of new and returning users to the website. Then create a method called getSessionData, which will return our session data. With our service created, we'll generate a few components to display our controls: Session Info, Top Platform Info, and Top Browser. Session Info will display information about the total number of sessions. Top Platform Info will give us information based on the devices used to access the site, and Top Browser will display stats based on different browsers that are used. Inside the session-info.component.html file, add HTML that will create the header for the Session Info panel, a tooltip to provide additional context to users, markup for the FlexPy control, one of Wijmo's chart components, and a footer to display additional information on page views and session duration. For the FlexPy control, we'll set several properties on the element. First, assign it its own class name and set a palette of colors to be used by the chart. We'll also bind a few variables to the properties: item source, binding name, and binding. Item source is where we store the data that we want to load. Binding name tells the control what property to associate with the legend, and binding is the numeric value that we want to display in the chart graphic. Within the chart, set up a legend element and set the display position to none so the legend is not shown next to the chart. Space is limited in this case, so it isn't necessary to display the legend. With the markup created, navigate to the session-info.component.ts file to set up our data to load into this component. First, import the data service so we can retrieve the data. Then set up some variables with basic data referenced inside the markup, like average page views, average session time, total sessions, and the tooltip we want to display. Then add a constructor to reference the data service we created, return our session data, and store it in the data variable, which we'll use as our FlexPy's data source. After all that is completed, the last thing to do is add some CSS to style the component within the panel. Set some padding on the various divs so that everything is spaced out. Use positioning to center our statistics in our FlexPy control, and add coloring so that the numbers in the component stand out. Finally, add the component to our app.component.html file and run the application to see the FlexPy control in action. Now we'll create the components that will display information on the various platforms through which users access the site and the different browsers they use. First, add data to the data service to load into the chart controls. Inside the data.service.ts file, add two variables: platform load time data and platform session data, which will contain the mock data to be displayed. Let's also create two getter methods that will be used to return the variables. Then, inside the top-platform-info.component.ts file, load in that data to be used in the markup. Before loading the data, we need to import two things: the data service, so that we have access to the data we just added, and a variable from Wijmo's chart module called WJChart to generate the color palette we want to use. Then, inside the component, add some variables that will hold the data, a tooltip we can display, and the palette we'll use for the charts. The last thing we'll do in this file is add the constructor, and use that to load in the data we want to display. With data created and loaded into the component, we can now add the markup for Wijmo's chart controls and some CSS to style the component. Inside the top-platform-info.html file, add the markup for a FlexChart control and another FlexPy control. Since we previously set up a FlexPy control, let's focus on the FlexChart component now. You'll quickly notice that there are some similarities between FlexChart and FlexPy. They both use an item source property to load the data. They can each make use of Wijmo's FlexChart Legend component, and you can change the palette of the chart. However, we're also adding multiple series to this chart. The data we're loading has two different fields that we want to display so that we can compare them: stats from the previous month and stats from the current month. So, create the series in Markup and bind the associated property values with their respective series. You'll also notice the FlexPy that we've set up here. This is very similar to the one we set up to display user session information. It includes a header, the data source, its associated bindings, and the palette that we've selected. Now, inside the component's CSS file, add some CSS. You'll notice there's not a lot added. We're just defining the header's appearance, the component's display setting, in this case flex, and adding some styles to the chart control. Here, we're removing the border and defining a height and width. Finally, add media tags, so the dashboard will be responsive to the screen size the user is viewing the site on. With the setup complete for the top platforms component, let's move back to the app.component.html file and load in our new component using Markup. Now, when we run the application, the dashboard shows the FlexChart and FlexPy components we've added. With the platform information component complete, we'll move on to displaying the browser information in the top browser component. This component will use the same styling and control as the previous component, but it will display different data, so much of this code will look familiar. First, open the data service and add some new data into the browser load time and browser session data arrays, which will also include getter methods to return the data. Then navigate to the top-browser.component.ts file and use the service to load in our data. We'll also create a tooltip to display and adjust the color palette to match that of our top platform info component. Lastly, create the constructor and use it to load in the data from the service. Next, we'll add the markup and CSS for the component. Inside the top-browser.component.html file, add the required HTML for the component. You'll notice that this markup is identical to that of the component we previously created. This one will also use a FlexChart and FlexPy control to display our data. The only difference between the two is the data that is displayed. Then navigate to the top-browser.component.css file and add the CSS. This CSS is identical to that of the other component we created, but it matches the class names of this component. With that complete, we can launch the application. When it loads, you'll see that the dashboard now displays information on both the top platforms and the top browsers that visitors to this site use. The last topic we'll cover in this video is adding linear gauges to display the traffic share of the top 10 countries where users are located. To start, create a new component, top-country-info. Inside the top-country-info.component.html file, add the code to display Wijmo's linear gauge control. Since we want to show a list of these components, we'll start by using a for loop to loop through all the items in the list of data. Then we'll use the values in the created data to set the max for each linear gauge. This is the maximum value at which the gauge will display. We're also setting each country's number of visits as the gauge's value property. This will determine how much the gauge is filled versus its maximum value. Next, navigate to the top-country-info.component.ts file and create a few variables to hold the data we want displayed. The country data variable holds the top 10 countries we'll display, the number of visits in the thousands, and the percentage that those visits make up out of the total number of visitors. We're also setting max visits, which is equal to the maximum number of visitors by a single country, and the tooltip for this panel's tooltip icon. Lastly, open the top-country-info.component.css file and add the CSS to style the linear gauges. Note that we're setting the overflow Y value to scroll, so that when this list extends past the bottom of its parent element, users will be able to scroll through the rest of the data that extends out of the view range. Finally, in the app.component.html file, add the markup for the component and run the application. In the browser, you'll see that the for loop has generated each of the respective items in the list and given each a gauge to show each item's visitors versus the max number of visitors from a country. In the final video of this series, we'll add several data grids to our dashboard, as well as an interactive map using GeoJSON data. To learn more, visit developer.meshius.com/Wijmo.